if I am running my amps effects loop and I want to do stereo, why can't I run 2 amps effects loops in their entirety? So basically you have your dry effects, and I have some diagrams I'm going to show here in a second. You have your dry effects, and then you split to both amp inputs, both amp effects sends to your wet and modulation effects, both amp effects returns, and then you have your 2 cabs. Why is that a bad idea? We've covered this a little bit on Chairman of the Boards, might have been 6 to 8 weeks ago now, if you want to hear a full episode on it. But basically, thank you, Jeff. I do enjoy my flannel. Basically, here is the diagram. I'm going to go through this in detail. But if you wanted to run 7 cable method, so guitar is 1, send to both amps is 2 and 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. That's a 7 cable method. Why is this a bad idea? So what you're going to need is your guitar plugging into maybe your overdrives, maybe a boost, distortion, compressor might be in there. That's your dry effects. Then you're going to need to go to a split, and most likely it's going to be a buffered split. Might be Isolator TX from us. Radial has some ABY products. It could be any number of different splits out there. Then you're going to go to both amp inputs. So we have the signal here going to both amp inputs. Both amp effects sends go to your wet effects. This might be a stereo chorus, stereo delay, stereo reverb, stereo flanger, tremolo, all sorts of things could be represented by these stereo wet effects. Then the final stereo outputs are going to go back to both amp effects returns. You can tell I've had too much coffee today. My hands are shaking like crazy. Both amp effects returns out of the final left and right output of your last stereo effect. Let's say it's a reverb. And then finally, you go to both cabs, cab 1 and cab 2. That sounds in theory like such a great idea. The main reason this is not going to be a great idea, amp effects loops are not all created equal. That's problem number 1. So amp effects send number 1 and amp effects send number 2 are probably going to be sending different levels. So you might have one that is running, at -3 and the other one at -6. So now this wet effect is seeing 2 different input levels on the first effect input. Let's say it's your delay. That's problem number 1. So let's say you can level that out. You can adjust the level, equal the levels out from both amp effects loops. You've overcome problem number 1. Problem number 2 is the ground loop potential that you are going to get running a 7 cable method is huge. And I put an X on screen on all the spots that you are potentially going to need an audio transformer to actually correct this issue, both with phase and with possible ground loops. So we have amp number 1 up here, amp number 2 down here. If you wanted to run a 7 cable method, you are most likely going to need to have the option to ground lift on the amp input, the effects send to your wet effect, the effects return from your wet effect, and worst case, possibly also the effects return of amp number 1. Audio transformers are not cheap. And so right now, if we were to build a custom junction to get this done, which we've done in the past, although I have to say, with everything in me, I try and dissuade customers from doing the 7 cable method, and I'll show you an easier way in just a sec, because it is so problematic, or has the potential to be problematic in so many different areas, that it's just something you don't really want to get into if you can avoid it. So we do a product called Buzzkill, which is essentially a passive box. It's a transformer in a box with ground lift and phase built in. And you would want to buy 3 Buzzkills to take care of all this, possibly 4, or get a custom solution done that has everything in the one box. That's expensive, that's a bit frustrating, and depending on the venue, you might need all these transformers, you might need 2, you might need 3, this is the most likely scenario, or you might need 4, depending on the venue and how well the power has been done, how well the effects loops on your amps have been done. There's a whole bunch of factors that make 7 cable method an absolute nightmare. So what do you do instead? Let's say you are into amp effects loops. You want to run stereo, but 7 cable method really isn't a great idea. What we can do is something up with my pitch. Is my camera being an absolute ridiculous scenario right now. Let me know if my voice is pretty high pitch. I swear I've hit puberty, but my voice is pretty high pitched to begin with. So if my pitch is super low right now, I really apologize. This is the solution. 5 cable method. We went from 7 cable, now we're down to 5 cable. The routing for this, you still get to use both your amps effects loops, but kinda. This is what you do. Guitar goes into your dry effects. Again, this is distortion, this is overdrive, compressor, boost. Your dry effects are represented by this label here. I have to say the reason I did labels is because I write like a 4-year-old. I have very messy writing, so I figured I'd make it readable for you guys. So guitar into your dry effects, then you go into amp 1's input only. You do not go into amp 2's input. Amp 1's effects send only goes to your wet and modulation effects. Those split into stereo. So let's say you go mono into a chorus, stereo out of that chorus into a stereo delay, stereo out of that delay into a stereo reverb, and then stereo out of your last wet effect, which is the reverb, back to both amp effects returns. So we are only using, to clarify, the effects return on amp 2. We are not using the amp input. We're not using the amp effects send on amp 2, just the return, which means you have the tone stack, the input and effects send. Everything in between is the tone stack and preamp on amp 1, feeding all of your wet effects, and then we're using the power sections of both amps, as you can see here by the effects returns. Now you can only see one X on the page, which is right here. Now you will potentially only need one transformer to correct against phase and ground lift issues. Worst case, you need 2, but that is unlikely. You might need one on the amp 1's effects return. But most likely just one transformer, one buzzkill to correct the ground loop and phase issues in a 5 cable method rig. If you get rid of all this, this is a 4 cable method. And now we're adding the stereo option with 5 cable. You like that? Peekaboo. That's it. That's the 5 cable method rig, and that is the fix to what I get asked every week. How do I run 2 independent amp effects loops? Yes, it's doable, but it is a complete nightmare if you want to do 7 cable method, or also known as 2 independent amp effects loops. You need all sorts of transformers, level adjustments. You need a whole bunch of stuff to correct that and make it work. So if you absolutely need 7 cable method, it is doable, but you are in for possibly a world of hurt if you try and do it without the proper isolation, level controls everywhere you need. So that is the difference between 7 cable. I get asked for this all the time. This is what I tell people they should do instead. 9 times out of 10, probably 9.5 times out of 10, I can convince people this is the way to go. But sometimes people really need it, and that is just what they need for their rig, and then it's a long conversation. Can you expand on the cases where amp 1 will also need a ground lift? Yeah, so good question. Let's say you're running 4 cable method, which, let me get my diagram out here. 4 cable method is this: guitar, dry effects, amp input, effects send to your modulation and wet effects, delay and reverb, back to the effects return on amp 1 only. This doesn't exist. And then you go out to your cab. So most likely you will not need a transformer on any of this most of the time. Every once in a while, though, there is a difference in ground potential between the effects send and the effects return, and that is going to cause a ground loop within the system. So worst case, you will need a transformer on the effects return of your 4 cable method setup. And that's where something like Buzzkill, other companies, I think EBTech also makes a ground lift box. It doesn't come with polarity or phase correction though. EBTech I think also makes something. I'm sure Radial probably does something. They do some great solutions. Buzzkill is on our website, where basically it's just a transformer in a box so that you can just insert it into your signal chain wherever you need it for that gig. And the good thing about getting a standalone passive box that you just patch in as needed is you can test it out. Let's say test it on the effects send, test it out on the effects return. You can easily move it to different spots in your signal chain. DIs can be used, yes. You just want to make sure that the transformer is actually not going to do you too much harm. Transformers, no matter what people say, transformers will degrade your signal a little bit. Depending on the transformer, that can be a lot or it can be a little bit. And again, in 7 cable, when you need to use up to 4 transformers, if you're not using good transformers, that can cause a lot of tone degradation in your system if they aren't good. I know we've spent the last 10 years just trying out different transformers over time, and we finally settled on one we're really happy with. And I know a lot of other high-end audio companies will do the same. Like, it's really hard to find a great transformer that fits in a size enclosure that you need, but isn't going to introduce all this extra distortion and, saturating the core of the transformer if you send a high-level signal to it. So transformers are something that are very handy, but if you can avoid using them, why would you put that in your signal if you don't need to? So again, thank you guys so much. That is 7 cable and the preferred 5 cable if it can be done for you guys. I think that is it for today. Just wanted to hop on and say hello. It's good to see you guys. Now to go chop down some trees. Just kidding. See you later.